This just in, banks are begging and pleading their customers to answer their calls. The problem and the debts are mounting up, and these home loan deferrals are becoming a bigger and bigger risk, and it's turning into a ticking time bomb. In this video, I'm going to go over how the banks are calling their customers, trying to get them to repay their home loans, but the customers aren't answering their phone calls. I'm also going to go over how this is going to be a big risk for the housing market if all of a sudden banks start foreclosing on customers that don't answer their calls. It says here, the nation's top financial regulators and bankers are pleading with borrowers who have deferred home loans due to the pandemic to pick up the phone and stop screening calls from their lenders. Morning representatives from the Reserve Bank of Australia, the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority APRA, the Australian Securities and Investment Commission and the National Australian Bank urged borrowers with an estimated 46 billion of frozen loans to stop ghosting the banks. And if for all those viewers that aren't hip with all the latest trends, ghosting is when pretty much someone cuts off all communication with you. Kind of like when that girl you meet on Tinder and you think it went really well and she really likes you, you think she could be the one, you think she could be the mother of your children, and someone finally understands you and then stops answering your calls and leaves and breaks your heart. That's what ghosting is. So really all the big boys, APRA, the ASIC, the Reserve Bank of Australia are getting in on this because this is a huge risk. $46 billion of frozen loans, and it doesn't take much properties to go on the market before sales to affect the prices in your area. If there's a couple of forced sales in your suburb, then that affects confidence in the suburb. Buyers may feel like they've got a bit more negotiating power and may start negotiating harder. NAB CEO Ross McEwen said the bank was still having trouble getting customers with deferred loans to return calls as the 6-month payment holiday drew to a close. And this is something I'm not hearing the media talk about. They keep saying that the home loan deferrals have been extended until March, but what actually is happening right now is banks are calling customers unless you've got a very, very, very good reason not to pay. They're going to start wanting you to repay. And also some people may have just put their home loan repayment on deferral so they could save more money, or maybe some people just wanted to spend more money. So this is money now going to be taken out of the economy. It's going to go to pay off debt, and paying off debt is deflationary, not inflationary. So yeah, there definitely are some problems mounting up here. NAB CEO said, "Just talk to us, pick up the phone, and I'll be there." No, just kidding, he didn't say that. Mr. McEwen said the absolute worst thing for a customer to do is stop talking. And look, I can empathize with people here, because I remember when I was about 20, I had a personal loan, I lost my job, and then the bank started calling, and the last thing you want to do when you're going through financial stress is talk about negotiating debts with the banks, and it's pretty scary. But at the end of the day, it's right. You do want to pick up the phone, speak to them, try to sort something out. And the more and more you put it off, the more and more that anxiety builds up, and the more and more the fear builds up. It's kind of like just pulling off a band-aid. Just call them, try to figure something out, because they definitely do not want you to default. The quarterly statement released by the Council of Financial Regulators on Friday, just hours earlier, also zeroed in on problems created by the pandemic, placing its impact on SMEs and households at the top of its concerns. And that's right, there are a lot of households and SMEs doing it really tough. I don't know what they're going to do with all these frozen and bad loans, but something's very concerning. The banks are still classing these as performing loans and good loans. It's sounding like the subprime crisis in the US, when all of a sudden, all these loans that were sold to investors as good loans are mixed up with AAA rated loans. All of a sudden they went bad. So this is a huge, huge risk. They're putting out all the articles that the market's going to boom because of low interest rates and easy lending. Yes, that normally does, but we also got a huge amount of risk like these home loan deferrals, not only that, SME loans as well. CFR members, which includes the RBA, APRA and ASIC, gave the government's push to relax responsible lending laws their seal of approval. There we go, the seal of approval from the top. All the banks working together. The banks are such good, they're so friendly. As a critical element of ensuring the supply of credit to SMEs before attacking the thorny issue of borrowers with deferred home loans playing possum. The majority of loan deferrals expire in September and October, requiring the lenders to process a large volume of individual assessments, the statement said. So they keep saying, that it's been pushed out to November, the fiscal cliff and, the financial cliff and economic cliff has been moved. But then again, they're saying, no, we are going to start calling customers. And, I have heard from customers that got letters. There was a video on YouTube going around from Heinz that says where one of his viewers sent in a letter where AMP was demanding payment, and they said, if you don't come up with this payment within 7 days, we're going to take legal action against you. So the media is putting out, Team Australia, the banks and the government are working together to help out everyday Australians. But I'm sure in the back end, they're figuring out how can we get these customers to pay. We've got shareholders to pay dividends to. We need to start getting these loans performing. And, they may start being a bit less nice and a bit more forceful soon. It is important that borrowers who cannot resume full repayments engage with the lender or seek other assistance, such as through the National Debt Helpline. The worrying proportion of customers prepared to ignore emails, letters, text messages, phone calls from their banks was confirmed by Mr. McEwen at a House of Representative hearings just 3 weeks ago. So what do you think is going to happen with this? This sounds like a disaster. How do you think the banks are going to get out of this? Because, they said it at the start, they're doing it to help out everyday Australians. But really the only reason why they let people defer their home loans, because they were hoping that everything would recover in 6 months and then they could start repaying. And it's not because they care about, the everyday Australian. They just didn't want mass amount of defaults because their balance sheets would be put at risk. Because the banks don't want house prices to go down, because if all of a sudden a bunch of people go into negative equity, it's the individual's problem. But if all of a sudden hundreds of thousands go into negative equity, it's all of a sudden the bank's problem. He said, the thing that distresses me right now is when we're making calls to customers to check in, 20% won't pick up the phone or call back, even if we text, email and phone. So it definitely looks like the banks are starting to sweat and starting to stress. If our customers are in pain, then the last thing they want to see is their banks winning off the back of them. And that's right, I don't want to see the banks winning off, everyday Australians struggling. Based on APRA data for August published on Wednesday, that means borrowers responsible for as much as 46 billion out of Australia's 229 billion in frozen loans are giving banks the silent treatment. And you know what, I don't blame them. Banks have been bullying Australians for years. If it was just, a few people struggling, I'm sure they just would default on them straight away. But, the banks don't want to be looking bad here. They're not your friends. They're just doing it because it's part of their own interests. They don't want their balance sheets to be at risk. And they also don't want the bad media press, because they have been getting a lot of bad press lately. The impact of the pandemic was at top of mind for the CFR, which noted the muted demand for credit from SME sector, but said it expected demand to improve as the health and economic outlook improved. So if you run a small business, would you be taking out huge amounts of debt now? I definitely wouldn't, especially with so much uncertainty. And they just want the problem to be fixed by throwing more and more debt at it. That's not going to fix the problem. They need to actually fix the fundamental things that are wrong with the economy, like creating jobs, getting more efficient, more productive. Just throwing more debt and more money at it is only going to push the problem down the road. The majority of loan deferrals expire in September and October, requiring lenders to process large volume of individual assessments. APRA and ASIC are working closely with lenders during this process, the CFR said. I thought ASIC and APRA were there to, regulate the banks and make things more sound and responsible, but it just seems like the banks are actually manipulating ASIC and APRA, and it really seems like the banks have all the power. Because, they had this Banking Royal Commission. They said they were going to, make everything more responsible. And now all of a sudden, all the things out of the Royal Commission, that's so 2018. And they've forgotten everything about it, and they're just going back to normal. At its peak, Mr. McEwen said NAB was taking more phone calls in a week than they typically would in a year. The bank had doubled the number of staff members who are working with customers with frozen loans and was prepared to extend holidays on a case-by-case basis. That's crazy, more phone calls in a week than in a year. And the property speakers keep going out there saying that property's gonna boom. But if people start, mass defaulting and people start figuring out about this, then I think confidence could definitely drop, and I don't know, how it's gonna play out over long term. Yes, because of the easy lending and low interest rates, it may go up in the short term, but long term, there is some huge risk mounting up. He said, "We are not going to do it across the board. There is no point deferring and building up a lot of long-term debt for yourself." So there we go. NAB CEO is saying they're not going to keep deferring, because there were some, property speakers or some, investors speculating that they'll just keep extending it. It'll be all right. The banks will never stop this scheme, but the banks are now starting to, get a bit more tougher. They're starting to say, no, we're not going to extend it. And we really have to watch over the next few months to see if a lot of customers do start getting these demand letters. And I really do hope for those people that are struggling that they can work something out with the banks, because this is definitely a huge issue. Mr. McEwen also elaborated on his decision back in April to shave director salaries by 20%, cancel short-term incentives for his executive team, and have both measures applied to his own package. So good on you, Mr. McEwen. He's roughing it out with the everyday Australians taking a pay cut. But I do wonder if there's kind of some other sneaky ways that they could still, be getting their bonuses, or maybe, they'll take a pay cut this year, but then they'll get double next year, or maybe they'll be given shares in the bank. So they're not technically getting paid, but if they're given shares, assets, they're still making pretty much the same money if they sell those shares. He said, there should be a direct correlation between the prosperity of a bank's stakeholders and the pay of its employees. And I do agree there, if you're a shareholder and they're cutting dividends, you'd hope they want to be cutting, the top executives paid too, maybe not the everyday Australians on the front line though. He said, the distress in the community was evident, with shareholders having to contend with a slashed dividend and businesses going to the wall, and it wouldn't be right to profit from them. Oh, they're so sweet and they're so nice, they don't want to profit from them. That's, just a complete PR stunt. They definitely do want to profit. Banks are all about profit. He said, we should only be winning if our customers are winning. Yeah! Mr. McEwen said, if our customers are in pain, then the last thing they want to see is their banks winning off the back of them. So, these mortgage repayment deferrals are a huge risk for the Australian property market right now. Like I said, the property brokers will keep telling you that everything's fine, there's no issues, but there's all this debt and there's all these problems that started in March that were covered up that are now mounting and mounting up. And we're not really going to see these issues play out until early next year, because a lot of recessions, it doesn't just happen like, 6 months, everything's, bad after 6 months and then it goes good. Normally recessions play out after a couple of years, and the issues that started in March can take a while before they start to show. But, of course, the media will keep coming out there and they'll say to the death, till the last minute, that everything's fine, until all of a sudden it's not. So what do you think? Do you think that everything's going to be fine? Customers will start repaying? Do you think that banks will just keep extending and extending for these customers that are going through hardship? Or do you think the banks are going to start toughen up and start demanding payment, or want some kind of other assets, or want them go to interest only? What do you think the bank's going to do, and how can they get out of this situation? For all my loyal viewers and subscribers still watching, you're awesome. And if you haven't already, smash the like button, follow the whole YouTube algorithm. It really helps out the channel a lot. And if you haven't already, subscribe. I'll keep you up to date and informed on the latest property market news, Australian economy news, and of course, I'll see you in the next video.